Hello and welcome. This video is a description of what I call MegaCatan and an explanation of how to play the game. MegaCatan is a combination of all of the major and most of the minor scenarios that have been released for the world-renowned board game Settlers of Catan. In this video, I, your host, Catan, will be reviewing the different rules for each of the Catan scenarios that are used to make up the MegaCatan game. I'll also be covering a few house rules that are in place to make these scenarios more cohesive when they interrelate with each other and ultimately provide a more strategic and fun gameplay experience. But before we begin this video, I want to acknowledge that this video is in no way affiliated with Catan Studio or Catan GmbH, and it's purely intended to describe a fun and somewhat novel way to combine all of the different scenarios available into one giant scenario. In addition, there are a few custom tiles shown in this video, which have been created by Tabletop Monthly, and I would encourage folks to check out that seller's Etsy store if you'd like to obtain those tiles for yourself. Okay, so now that we've covered the legal stuff, let's start with the basics first. Within the game of Catan, there are 5 basic resources that are used to create most buildings and other structures. These resources are brick, wheat, ore, wood, and sheep. Brick is obtained from brick hexes, as shown. Wheat is obtained from wheat hexes, which are sometimes also referred to as grain hexes by certain cards. Ore is obtained from ore hexes, or mountain hexes, depending on how the card calls them out. Wood or logs are obtained from forest hexes, and sheep or wool is obtained from sheep hexes, also sometimes referred to as pasture hexes. Now, brick is the first of the 5 basic resources. A brick card can be obtained by having at least one settlement point on a brick hex. The example of the brick hex is shown on the screen. A number token will be placed in the center of each resource hex in the game, and when a player rolls 2 dice and the sum equals that number, then all players with settlement points on that hex obtain one of the corresponding resource cards per settlement point on that hex. Settlement points are calculated based on the type of building that's constructed on a particular hex. We'll talk more about this later, but for now know that a settlement, which is one type of building, provides a player with a single settlement point on a resource hex, or hexes, that it's built on, whereas a city, another type of building, provides a player with 2 settlement points on those resources. There are several other building types as well, and again, we'll talk about this later on in the video. Now, a player who has 3 or more settlement points is eligible to obtain the Bricklayer Specialist tile, which is shown on the right side of the screen. This tile will go to the player with the most settlement points on the brick resource, and if there's a tie, no player will take control of this tile. A player who has the Bricklayer tile gains 1 victory point, or VP, allowing them to get that much closer to winning the game. In addition, at the start of the player's turn, before they take any other actions, they can declare to their fellow Catanians, i.e. the other players, "I am the bricklayer." If they do this, they can take 1 free brick card from the supply, which is basically the bank, before they begin their turn. Now, this can be done at the beginning of each of their turns, and if the player is a specialist for multiple resources, for example, with regards to sheep hexes being the shepherd, they can declare all of their titles at the same time and take all of the associated cards from the supply. The Bricklayer Specialty tile can be taken by another player at any time, even if it's not their turn, as long as that player has more settlement points on brick hexes than the current owner. If a player takes the tile on another player's turn, then it can't be used until that player, the new owner's turn. If any player notices that the current owner of the specialist tile does not have the most settlement points on that resource, and in fact another player has surpassed them, then they can mention this, but they're not obligated to say anything. It's up to the player who has the most settlement points to realize that they are the new owner and claim ownership of the specialist tile for themselves. If they don't, then the current owner retains possession of the tile. Wheat is the second of the 5 basic resources in the game, and it can be obtained by having a settlement point on a grain hex. The associated specialist tile for wheat is the farmer. It is also worth 1 victory point, and it follows the same rules that we just discussed for the Bricklayer Specialist tile. Wood is the third of the 5 basic resources in the game, and can be obtained by having settlement points on a forest hex. The associated specialist tile for wood is the lumberjack, and again it follows the same rules as the other specialist tiles. If playing with the Cities and Knights expansion, a player who has a city on the forest hex, can also obtain a commodity, in this case paper. Commodities can be used to advance the development chart, which is exclusive to playing with the Cities and Knights expansion, and that will allow a player to advance their societal development, providing a variety of benefits. More on that later in the video. Ore is the fourth of the 5 basic resources in the game, and it can be obtained by having settlement points on a mountain hex. The associated specialist tile for ore is the miner, and again, it follows the same rules as the other specialist tiles. In a similar manner to wood, if you're playing with Cities and Knights, a player that has a city on a mountain hex can also obtain a commodity, in this case, coin. Sheep, sometimes referred to as wool, is the 5th and final of the basic resources, and it's obtained by having settlement points on a pasture hex. Its associated specialist tile is the shepherd, and again, it follows the same rules as all of the others. Sheep also has an associated commodity if you're playing with the Cities and Knights expansion. Any player that has a city on a pasture hex can also obtain the commodity cloth. So we've covered the 5 basic resources, but let's go over in depth how players can collect these resources. As I mentioned, resources can be collected by having different buildings on hexes corresponding to that resource card. Cards generated equate to the number of settlement points that the building or buildings players control are worth. Buildings are constructed on the intersection of hexes as shown on the screen, and allow the owner to harvest resource cards from the hexes they are touching when the resource number, which is the number in the center of these hexes, is rolled. Probability of a number being rolled is shown by the number of small brown dots under the larger number in the resource token. As you can see on the screen, the 5 has more dots under it than the 4 or the 10, meaning that it's more likely for a 5 to be rolled than either of those other 2 numbers. Again, we'll go through buildings and structures in more depth later on, but for now know that the red building on the screen is a city that belongs to the red player. The smaller blue building is a settlement belonging to the blue player. As we discussed, cities are worth 2 settlement points, whereas settlements are worth only 1. Let's run through a few quick examples just to show you how resource production works. Let's assume for now we're not playing with the Cities and Knights scenario. On any player's roll, called a resource roll or a resource production roll, if we see a 5 come up on the sum of the 2 dice that are rolled, then all hexes on the board with a 5 production number will produce resources. Looking at our minimap here, only one of these hexes has a 5, the forest hex. The red player has a building touching this hex. In this case, that's a city, which is worth 2 settlement points, so 2 logs are produced for the red player. Now let's assume later in the game another player rolls, and this time the resource production roll is a 10. The red player's city also borders a pasture hex, or a sheep hex, with a 10 on it, so she takes 2 sheep cards from the supply. The blue player, however, has a settlement bordering the pasture hex as well, so he will also get a card, in this case 1 sheep card, as settlements are worth a single settlement point. Continuing on with this example, if a 4 were rolled, later on in the game, the red player would obtain 2 ore cards, and the blue player, having only a settlement, would obtain 1 ore card. Now let's consider this same example, but if we were playing with the Cities and Knights scenario. In this case, commodities come into effect as well. A player with a city would get the base resource and a commodity, as opposed to 2 cards of the base resource. So if a 5 is rolled, the red player gets 1 log, but also gets 1 paper. If a 10 is rolled, the red player gets a sheep and a cloth, but the blue player still only gets a sheep, as settlements do not produce commodities. Now on a 4 being rolled, the red player takes an ore and a coin, and the blue player still only obtains 1 ore card. Note that there is no commodity associated with brick or wheat, so those hexes would still produce 2 of the same basic resource, regardless of whether there was a city in place and owned by that player. There are 6 secondary resources in MegaCatan as well. These are gold fields, volcanoes, spice islands, oil springs, fish, and pirate lairs. Now, as a quick note, this last hex, pirate lairs, produces pirate gold or gold coins, not pirates themselves, just to clarify. Let's go through each of these one by one. Gold fields are a very valuable hex to settle on, as they allow a player to obtain any one basic resource of the player's choice per settlement point on a gold field hex. These resources don't have to be the same either. So for example, if a player has a city on a gold field hex, then they can take any two of the basic resources. They could, for instance, opt to obtain 2 brick cards, but they could also just as easily take an ore card and a wheat card. There is a specialty token associated with gold fields as well, and this is the gold grabber token, as shown on the right side of the screen. It follows the same rules as all the specialty tokens discussed for the basic resources earlier. Namely, you must have a minimum of 3 settlement points to obtain it, and it's worth 1 victory point. The distinguishing thing about the gold grabber token is that it lets you take any of the basic resources at the start of your turn when you declare your title, i.e., I am the gold grabber. It's not limited to one resource type like the other 5 specialty tokens we've discussed so far are, but instead can be used to fill in any resource gaps in your hand by allowing you to take one of these 5 basic resource cards, making it a very powerful tile. Volcanoes are very similar to gold in that, from a resource perspective, they also produce any one of the 5 basic resources in the exact same way that a gold field tile would. The gold grabber tile, the specialty tile, does not apply to volcanoes, however, only gold field hexes. So you can have 5 settlement points on volcanoes and none of those will count towards the gold grabber tile. The other caveat here is that volcanoes, as the name implies, have a chance to erupt. Let's look at this larger example map for our discussion of volcanic eruptions. When a 12 is rolled by any player during a production roll, all volcanoes on the board have a chance to erupt. The keyword there is chance. The player who triggered the possible eruption then rolls 1 dice for each volcano on the board. On an even number, the volcano will erupt. On an odd number, it would remain dormant. For the sake of our example, let's assume that the player rolls an even number for both volcanoes on this screen, and therefore both would erupt. That same player will then have to roll another dice for each volcano, this time to determine the direction the lava will flow from. In this example, it looks like the player rolled a 5 for the volcano on the left, which means the volcano lava will flow out from the 5 point on the hexagon. For the volcano on the right, the player rolled a 4, which means the lava will flow out from the 4 point on the hexagon. Let's consider the volcano on the left first. Again, the lava is flowing out from this point, the 5. This will immediately destroy the road between the brick and log hexes and will demote the city to a settlement. As a quick aside, the buildings and structures on the screen are probably somewhat unfamiliar at this point. We'll cover those later in the video. The lava has now reached an intersection as it approaches the pasture hex with a 9 resource number. The player who triggered the eruption now determines the direction of the lava flow by rolling 2 dice. On a result that's an even number, the lava will flow left from the point that it's currently facing. On an odd number, it will flow right. And if a 7 is rolled, the lava is considered to harden and it'll stop where it is, ending the eruption. As you can see on the screen, it looks like the player rolled an 8, which is an even number. So in this case, the lava will turn left and go out to sea, ending the eruption. In this particular example, the only casualties were the white player's city, which is demoted to a settlement, and his road, which is destroyed outright. Now let's look at the other volcano. The lava flows out from the 4 location that's circled and flows straight out to start. At this point, we again have to start rolling those 2 dice to see if it flows left, right, or stops. In this case, the player rolls a 5 on the first roll, and that's an odd number, so the lava will flow in a right direction. The player will roll again, gets another 5, which again is an odd number, so we get another right. Now the player rolls once more, and again we get an odd number, in this case a 3, so the lava flows in a rightwards direction once again. Now keep in mind that this right is a right from the direction the lava is currently facing, not necessarily a right from where a player is looking on the board. Now the player rolls again, and in this case that player gets a 9, so once again we're going right. At this point, the red player is in real trouble as their settlement is directly in the path of the lava. It hasn't been hit by the lava yet, but if the lava flow doesn't stop, that settlement will be destroyed regardless of whether the lava goes left or right, because it would pass through that intersection where the settlement is built. So the player who triggered the volcanic eruption will roll once more, and in this case they get an 8. So this destroys that red player's settlement as well as the road as the lava is turning left. The player will roll once more, and this time it's a 7, which means the lava stops. The lava won't move forward at all from the space that it's currently on, and it would be considered to dry up, ending the eruption. If there was a building on the intersection directly in front of where the lava is, that building would not be destroyed, as the lava hadn't reached it. In this example, there is no building there, so it's irrelevant. In this particular example, the casualties are the red player's settlement and the red player's road, and those are removed from the board. So now let's talk about spice and the spice islands, or spice hexes. These are sometimes called jungle hexes as well. If a player settles on one of these hexes, then when a resource number associated with that hex is rolled, the player takes a random spice card from the bank. This could be one of 3 particular spices, and in order of appearance on the screen, these are cinnamon, pepper, and nutmeg. Now once a player has any 3 of a kind of a particular spice card, that's worth 1 victory point. At that point in time, the player will have to get 4 of that same kind of spice to score another victory point in spice. However, if they collect 3 of a different kind of spice, then they would get 1 victory point for that second type of spice. So for example, I can get 3 cinnamon cards and set those aside in what's called a victory point stack, and that gives me 1 victory point. If I then later on collect 4 cinnamon cards, I can get another victory point in cinnamon. I would then need 5 more cinnamon cards to get another cinnamon spice victory point. However, at any point during that process, I can also collect 3 pepper cards and obtain 1 victory point in pepper as well. Now, spice collection is independent of what other players have gathered also. So if another player has to start collecting 6 or 7 cinnamon cards to get their next victory point, and I haven't harvested spice at all, I only need to get those first 3 cards to get my first victory point in that spice. An important note here as well is that until a player sets spice cards aside in that victory point stack that I mentioned, they can be stolen by other players out of the owner's hand via the robber, mercenary, monopoly card, or other card effects. Spice is also a non-renewable resource, meaning that once the supply of spice cards runs out in the game, there's no new spice that can be produced by any players, regardless of what resource number is rolled and how many buildings they have on a spice hex. This basically means that these buildings are now, from a resource production standpoint, worthless, and the hex is considered barren. Now there's also a specialist tile associated with spice, and this is the best spice merchant tile. It has a slightly different look from the other specialist tiles that we've run through thus far because it's from a different expansion of the game, but it's also worth 1 victory point, and it functions the exact same way as those other tiles. Another resource hex found in MegaCatan is the oil springs hex. Now, oil springs are symbolized by desert hexes, pasture hexes, or forest hexes that have a square oil spring tile placed over them, as shown in the left side of the screen. Now, in those latter 2 situations, pasture or sheep hexes no longer produce sheep or cloth, and forest hexes no longer produce log or paper. They all only produce oil tokens. An oil token is shown at the bottom of the screen, and it's a square with, shockingly enough, some oil on it. This token can be exchanged for any 2 of the same basic resource card. For example, it could be exchanged for 2 wheat, 2 sheep, 2 brick, 2 ore, or 2 logs, but it could not be exchanged for 1 wheat card and 1 log card, because those are not the same. It must be exchanged for 2 of the same resource. Oil can also be used to build a structure called an oil rig, which we'll talk about in more depth when we get to the buildings and structures section of this video. Now, spending oil will move players down the disaster track, and spending too much will cause an oil disaster, which is essentially a natural disaster on the island of Catan. This has the potential to damage all of Catan, and we'll get to that more in a moment. If that sounds like some bad juju though, then you're in luck. There's a third use for those that want to be environmentally friendly. Oil can be sequestered at a rate of 1 oil tile per turn. Now, once a player sequesters 3 total oil tiles, they gain 1 victory point for that. In addition, the first player to sequester 3 oil tiles gains the Environmentalist of Catan Global Achievement token, which is valued at an additional 2 victory points. Any player that sequesters more oil throughout the game will take this environmentalist token for themselves. And if there's ever a tie for the most oil sequestered, then that token goes back to the supply and is not awarded to any player. Players can only have a maximum of 4 oil tiles in their hand at any one time. Now, sequestered oil does not count towards this total. But if a player has 4 oil tiles in their hand and they have the opportunity to harvest more oil because a resource production number that they have a settlement or other building on has been rolled, they have to pass and not harvest this oil. They can't add it to their hand. Now, oil can't be stolen by the robber or the mercenary, and it does not count towards a player's maximum hand size. In parallel to that, oil can also not be stolen by the pirate or the raider. And as all of those terms are probably unfamiliar, we'll get to those later in the video as well. Now, oil, just like spice, is a finite resource. And once the supply of oil is fully extinguished in the game, no new oil can be produced by players, even if the resource number for an oil springs hex that they're settled on is rolled. Just like spice, these are basically treated as barren hexes. So you might be thinking to yourself, oil disaster? That doesn't sound so good. Well, you're right, it's not. As players spend oil, they advance the oil tile down the disaster track as shown on the screen, at a rate of 1 space per oil tile spent. The longer path is noted by the 5 to 6 numbers, and that's used if more than 4 players are playing the game. Once the tile reaches the end of the disaster track, an oil disaster will occur. An important note here is that if a player causes the oil disaster by building an oil rig, then the oil rig is considered built on the board before the disaster goes into effect. Now, the disaster can take one of 2 general forms: coastal flooding or a resource production hex going barren. The player who triggered the disaster will roll both dice and determine the nature of the disaster from this roll. If a 7 is rolled, then the disaster will be coastal flooding. And if it's any other number, then the disaster will be a resource hex going barren. So let's consider coastal flooding first. This means that any city or harbor settlement that's on the coast of Catan, in other words, touching an ocean hex, would be demoted to a settlement. And any outpost or settlement that's on the coast would be outright destroyed. In addition, cities that are built on lakes would be demoted to settlements, and any outpost or settlement that's built on a lake would also be outright destroyed. On this map, you can see that the white player has a harbor settlement on the coast, and the red player has a city and an outpost on the coast. The blue player hasn't settled on the coastline, but she does have a city and a settlement around the lake. So when coastal flooding occurs in this example, all of the hexes around the coast are considered to be flooded, as well as the lake hexes. In this case, the blue and red cities will be demoted to settlements, and the blue settlement and red outpost will be completely destroyed. The white settlement is going to be safe because it's not considered to be bordering water. It's important to note that coastal flooding has no impact on bridges, roads, or ships. If a player had an oil rig or a metropolis on a city that was on the coastline and coastal flooding occurred, then that city would be protected and it wouldn't be demoted. The second possible type of oil disaster is if a player doesn't roll a 7, but instead rolls any other number. Let's say in this example that a player rolls a 4. In this case, all players will then scan the board for all the 4s, and for each 4 resource number, they'll roll 1 dice each. Looking at our mini-map here, we have 1 4 on a grain hex in the bottom left, a 4 on brick in the middle, and another 4 on brick in the top right of the board. The players will roll the dice for each of these 4s, and in this example, they get a 6 for the grain hex, a 6 for the brick hex in the middle, and only a 2 for the brick hex on the right side of the board. So that last hex we can rule out, it's safe and it won't be going barren. The other ones we have to roll again for. So on this second roll we get a 4 for the grain hex and a 5 for that brick hex in the center of the board. Since the brick hex in the center got the highest overall roll, that's the one that the disaster hits, and that's the hex that goes barren. This is denoted by flipping the resource number over, and that hex no longer produces any resources for the rest of the game. It's basically considered a swamp hex or an empty desert hex from this point forward. An important note here is that since the hex is now considered barren, it's not considered a brick hex any longer for determining settlement points as related to the brick specialist tile. And of course, by extension, if this were not a brick hex but a wheat hex, it would be the same thing for the wheat specialist tile. In this case, the white player had a settlement on brick and would normally have been counting that settlement towards the brick specialist tile as one settlement point. Since this hex is no longer considered brick, that settlement is no longer worth a settlement point for brick. It's just a barren hex. Now, extending that example a little bit, let's say that the white player did have the bricklayer tile because somewhere else on the board that's off the board that's on the screen here, they had 2 other settlement points on brick for 3 total. If they lost this one and then they only had 2 settlement points total on brick, they would no longer be the bricklayer. They would have to forfeit that specialist tile to the supply or to another player who had 3 settlement points on brick that achieved that after the original owner of this tile. Now, there are a few special rules if the oil disaster ends up hitting certain resource hexes. If it hits a volcano, the resource production number on the volcano is removed, making the volcano barren, but the volcano will have the additional impact if it will always erupt when a 12 is rolled. You wouldn't roll that additional dice to see if it's even or odd to determine the eruption. It would always happen. If the oil disaster were to hit an oil springs hex, then the oil supply available to all players loses half of the available oil tokens, thus making it much more likely that the supply will run dry and all oil hexes later in the game will basically be considered barren hexes. If the disaster were to hit an iceberg hex, the iceberg gains another resource number, making the ice more likely to break and shift, and more on that later on when we talk about icebergs. So that's oil disasters. Not pretty, right? Once the oil disaster occurs, the tracker is going to be reset and that whole process will begin again. We saw a lake hex in the last example, and you might be wondering, what the heck is that? Well, that's one of 2 ways to get fish in the game of Catan. It's technically called a fish hex or a fishery. And the other type of fishery is a coastal fishery, which would be placed on an ocean or coastline tile. And this is simplified by the more triangular looking tile on the left side of the screen. Either way, a settlement point on one of these hexes will produce 1 random fish tile for each settlement point. Fish tiles are randomly pulled from the fish supply and can have 1, 2, or 3 fish on them, each equating to, as logic suggests, 1, 2, or 3 units of the fish resource. Fish tokens can be placed face down so other players don't know exactly how many fish their rivals have, but this is not a requirement. There's also a small chance that a player will pull the old boot token from the fish supply, and if this is pulled, it must be revealed immediately. Now, the old boot can basically be considered to be a negative victory point, but it's not quite the same. The old boot's actually considered to be a +1 to win, and this is slightly worse than a negative victory point. Reason being is that some cards in the game target the leading player, and since the old boot is +1 to win, a player can have that tile and still require 1 more victory point to win the game, but is still technically in the lead and ahead of other players, and therefore they can be targeted by those game cards that target the leading player. The old boot can, on its owner's turn, be transferred to any other player in the game as long as the player that's going to be receiving the old boot has as many or more victory points than the boot's current owner. There's also a specialist tile associated with the fish resource as well, and this is the best fisher tile. It's worth 1 victory point and it functions the same way as the other specialist tiles we've discussed throughout this video. Now, you might be wondering at this point, what can I spend my fish on? And that's where the fish market comes into play. Fish can be spent in a variety of different ways to help players progress throughout the game. 2 fish can be spent to steal a random resource or commodity card from another player's hand. Now, this excludes oil, pirate gold coins, or other fish tiles, but it does include spice if that spice card is not already in a victory point stack. 3 fish can be used to remove the robber or pirate token, or to remove another player's mercenary or raider token. Basically, you can choose one of these 4 tokens and take it and move it to a vacant space. 4 fish can be traded for a basic resource of the player's choice. 5 fish can be traded to build a road or build a ship. 6 fish can be traded to the bank to build a bridge or to collect an oil token from the supply. This obviously assumes that the supply still has oil, and oil has not yet run out, and 7 fish can be traded by a player to buy a random development card or progress card with their choice of color. Now, if fish are exchanged with the bank, there is no change. This means that if you buy, for example, a resource card with 3 fish tiles, equating to a total of 6 fish, you do not get 2 fish back from the bank. You'd have to either spend a 3 fish tile and a 1 fish tile to get your total of 4, and then you don't need change. Or if you exceed the amount and you would require change, you can't get that change back. So you need to be careful about the denomination of the fish tile that you're spending if you want to conserve your resources. Pirate lairs are the last of the secondary resources in MegaCatan, and these are symbolized by a hex which generally has a river running through the middle of it and a little building in the center, usually also with a small black pirate flag on it, as you can see on the left side of the screen. These hexes produce 1 gold coin per settlement point on a pirate lair hex, and the premise here is that the player is able to sneak in and steal gold coins from the pirates living in this area. Now, gold coins can be used to purchase a basic resource at a rate of 2 gold coins for any one of the 5 basic resource cards, essentially making pirate lair hexes similar to gold field hexes, but not quite as good in that sense, because you need 2 resource production rolls to get 2 gold coins to get your 1 resource card, whereas with a gold field hex, you get a resource card when 1 production number is rolled. Now, in addition, 3 gold coins can be used to purchase a commodity card. These again are paper, coin, and cloth, as shown on the screen. The player with the most gold coins at any point in the game also gains the Wealthiest Settler Global Achievement card, and this is worth 1 victory point. If there's ever a tie for Wealthiest Settler, then no player takes this tile. There can, however, be a tie for Poorest Settler, and the player or players with the fewest gold coins get these Poorest Settler tiles. Having one of these tiles grants a player -2 victory points. Now, to get rid of the Poorer Settler tile, players, as logic suggests, only need to get richer and gain more gold. There's also a specialist tile associated with pirate lairs, and this is the Greatest Pirate Scourge. It's worth 1 victory point and functions the same way as the other specialist tiles that we've discussed. In this case, it lets the player take 1 gold coin per turn if they declare at the beginning of their turn, before taking any other actions, "I am the Greatest Pirate Scourge." Now, the last note here is that different editions of Settlers of Catan have different artwork for gold coins. The Explorers and Pirates gold coins have a 1 printed on the smaller coin and a 3 on the larger coin. The Traders and Barbarians coins do not have these denominations printed on them, but following the rules from Explorers and Pirates, the smaller coin is worth 1 and the larger worth 3. There are a few other spaces that players will encounter during the game as well, and these are ocean or sea spaces, which are essentially open water. This has no effect other than the fact that it requires ships to travel over it rather than roads. There are also swamp spaces. Now, swamp is generally a land tile that's found at the end of one of the rivers in Catan, and these don't produce resources. There is 1 swamp space with a gold nugget in the corner, and this is the green swamp tile shown on the screen. Constructing a building of any type on this nugget grants the player that owns that building 1 victory point. Desert spaces are barren land tiles as well, and these don't produce resources, unless otherwise indicated by the placement of, say, an oil tile over the desert hex, in which case it would be producing oil. I've alluded to this many times, but now it's finally time to learn about the different buildings and structures that can be purchased as you play a game of MegaCatan. Within the player bag, each player will find 5 settlement tokens, 4 outposts, 4 cities, 4 harbor settlements, 15 roads, 4 bridges, 15 ships, and 3 city walls. There's no limit to the total number of oil rigs available to players, as these are set aside and not specific to an individual bag of player pieces. However, as players can only build a total of 4 cities, only 4 oil rigs can be constructed per player as well. There are also 3 metropolises in the entire game, and these are also separate from the bag of player tokens. These metropolises are associated with the three major disciplines, trade, science, and politics, and players build these using commodity cards. We'll discuss them in depth momentarily, but they can be considered to be more global achievements. So settlements are one of the simplest structures that players can build. They don't require any prerequisites to construct, and generally, starting the game, I would recommend that players start with 2 settlements and 1 city pre-built. The cost to build a settlement is 1 wheat, 1 sheep, 1 log, and 1 brick, and a settlement is worth 1 victory point, and also worth 1 settlement point. That latter term means that if a settlement is built on a hex, it is producing 1 resource related to that hex if the resource production number is rolled. So like we discussed before, if I have a settlement on a brick hex with a 6 as the production number, I get 1 brick resource per settlement on that hex. An outpost can be considered a weaker form of a settlement. An outpost can be considered a weaker form of a settlement. It's a building that's worth 1 victory point when built, but has no value in settlement points. This means that regardless of where the outpost is placed, it will not produce any resources, nor will it count towards any of the specialist tiles in the game. An outpost can be constructed for the cost of 1 sheep and 2 logs, and like a settlement, it doesn't require any prerequisites to be built. You can upgrade an outpost to a settlement, but you need to pay the full settlement cost. 1 wheat, 1 log, 1 brick, and 1 sheep to do this. The other note here is outposts officially are denoted by a triangle token, but I use this more of lighthouse shaped token, and you'll see that used to symbolize outposts throughout this video. A city is the opposite of an outpost, basically. It's, instead of a weaker settlement, a city would be a more advanced settlement, an upgrade. Whereas the outpost produces no resources due to it being worth 0 settlement points, a city is worth a total of 2 settlement points and thus produces 2 resources. It's also worth 2 victory points. Now, a city costs 2 wheat and 3 ore to build, and it requires a settlement to be present at the location where you're constructing it. In other words, you're basically upgrading your existing settlements to cities. You can't just build cities outright. You also can't build a city on an outpost. You need a settlement there as the prerequisite. As we discussed earlier in the video, if you're playing with the Cities and Knights expansion, cities will produce 2 cards when the production number of a hex adjacent to a city is rolled. For mountain, forest, and pasture hexes, 1 resource and 1 commodity would be produced in this case, whereas for grain and brick hexes, it would still be the basic 2 resources of grain and brick, or wheat and brick. Now, if you're not playing with Cities and Knights, then cities will just produce 2 of the basic resource associated with the hexes that they are settled on. If a city is built on a secondary resource hex, then say fish, for example, then it would produce 2 fish tokens in the same manner because it's worth 2 settlement points. Now, harbor settlements are a unique type of settlement, and like cities, they require a settlement to be built first before they're constructed. They also can only be constructed on a location that's on the coast. In other words, they border a sea/ocean tile. They can't be built on lakes or completely enclosed by land. Harbor settlements are also worth 2 victory points, just like a city, but unlike cities, they're only worth 1 settlement point. This means that having a hex adjacent to a harbor settlement will produce 1 resource whenever the production number for that hex is rolled, as opposed to 2 as it would for a city. Harbor settlements and any other building we've mentioned thus far, outposts, cities, and settlements, all contribute to a player being able to achieve the Harbor Master Global Achievement card. And this card is valued at 2 victory points, and it's given to the player with the most settlement points on the coast, or basically harbors, with a minimum of 3 points. An important note here is that outposts, for the purposes of the Harbor Master card, are worth 1 point. They are still worth 0 settlement points in game, but when again counting towards this card, they're counted as 1 point if they are on the coast. Now, any player that exceeds the number of, we'll call these harbor points, that the owner of the current Harbor Master tile has, will then become the new owner of this tile, and they'll gain the 2 victory point boon that comes with ownership of it. Harbor settlements also have the neat effect that they function as a 2-to-1 port, similar to the ports in the original Settlers of Catan game. This port only works for basic resources, but it allows a player to trade the resources from hexes the harbor settlement is built on to the bank at this 2-to-1 rate. So for example, if I have a harbor settlement on a brick and a wheat hex, obviously the third hex here has to be ocean for me to build the harbor settlement because it's a harbor. Then I can trade 2 bricks to the bank for any one of the 5 basic resources of my choice. I can do the same with wheat, so I can trade 2 wheat cards for an ore card, for example. And I can do this in unlimited number of times, only limited by the number of cards in my hand. Now, suppose I build a harbor settlement on a spice and a wheat hex. And obviously, again, the third hex here would be an ocean hex. Now I can still trade the wheat with the bank at that 2-to-1 rate, 2 wheat for any 1 basic resource card of my choice, but I can't trade 2 spice cards to the bank in this manner, as spice is not a basic resource. Similarly, I could not trade that 2 wheat for 1 oil tile, as oil is a secondary resource, and I couldn't trade for spice, pirate gold, or fish either, as those are all also secondary resources. It's important to note here that resources and commodities can be traded to the bank in general for other basic resources at a 4-to-1 rate without the effect of a port. So at any point on a player's turn, they can trade 4 cards of the same type to the bank for 1 basic resource card. But players can never trade 4 basic resource cards to the bank for 1 commodity in this way. Oil rigs are another structure, and we alluded to them when we were discussing oil disasters. These are one of 2 tokens not found in the player's bag of colored tokens, the other one being the Metropolis token. Players can build a total number of oil rigs equal to the total number of cities that they can construct. If you're playing with 1 set of player pieces, this is 4 oil rigs. The cost to build an oil rig is 1 brick, 1 wheat, and 1 ore card, as well as 2 oil tokens. And spending each oil token will bring that disaster tracker that we discussed earlier 1 more space. So building an oil rig moves the disaster track a total of 2 spaces forward. An oil rig adds 1 additional victory point and 1 additional settlement point to a city. So a city with an oil rig is worth a total of 3 victory points and 3 settlement points, 2 from the city itself and 1 from the oil rig. If a resource number is rolled for a hex adjacent to a city that has an oil rig under it, the player who owns it gets 3 cards. 2 resources and 1 commodity if you're playing with the Cities and Knights expansion and you're on a forest, mountain, or pasture hex, or just 3 resources if you're playing without the Cities and Knights expansion or you're just on a different type of hex. Cities with oil rigs are also protected from coastal flooding, one of the possible types of oil disaster. If a city with an oil rig is hit by lava from a volcanic eruption, the oil rig will be completely destroyed and the city is still demoted to the settlement as usual. The oil rig does not protect the city in this scenario. Now, metropolises are buildings that are given to a player as part of a global achievement. There are 3 of these in the game, and these are obtained by spending commodities to complete your development chart, which again is part of the Cities and Knights expansion. There is 1 metropolis for each of the 3 major disciplines. Trade, which is symbolized by yellow progress cards and advanced by paying cloth. Science, which is symbolized by green progress cards and advanced by paying paper. And politics, which is symbolized by blue progress cards and advanced by paying coin. To construct a metropolis in any of these 3 categories, you need a total of 10 of the associated commodity cards, i.e. 10 paper cards to get the green science metropolis, for instance. A metropolis token can be placed on a city, and it makes that whole structure worth 4 victory points. 2 victory points from the metropolis itself, and 2 for the city. Now, metropolises are not worth settlement points, so a city with a metropolis on it will still produce 2 cards or tiles when the associated resource number is rolled. You can build a metropolis on a city with an oil rig if you so desire, and in that case, that entire complex is worth 5 victory points. 2 for the city, 1 for the oil rig, 2 for the metropolis, and that complex produces as 3 settlement points, 1 for the oil rig, 2 for the city. Now, having a metropolis on a city will protect it from coastal flooding, but it will not protect from volcanic eruptions. If a city with a metropolis is struck by lava, the city is demoted and the metropolis must be placed on another eligible city that that player owns. If no such city exists and the player can't place a token until a new city is built, then during that interim time, they don't realize the gains of having the metropolis, which means that they don't have those additional 2 victory points. The metropolis can also be stolen by another player, even if both players have maxed out development charts. If multiple players are eligible to steal the metropolis at the same time, then it's decided by the player who has the most cards of the associated commodity that's used to build that metropolis in his or her hand. And if there's still a tie, then players break that by rolling the highest number on the dice. More on the development chart and the benefits of these progress cards later on. The road is a basic unit that's used to travel across land on the island of Catan. Building a road costs 1 brick and 1 log, or, if we recall our fish market discussion earlier, 5 fish. Roads must be connected to existing player tokens of the same color, roads or other buildings or structures, for example. Roads can't be built across water, either across rivers or across the ocean. They can be built along the coastline, since the coastline is still land. Having 5 or more unbroken roads grants a player the longest road global achievement, and I'll refer to this tile as the longest trade route global achievement moving forward in this video, as the name is a bit misleading if you call it longest road. A trade route can consist of roads, bridges, or ships, and therefore this global achievement applies to all of them. Players must have a building between roads and ships in order for sea and land shipping lanes to be considered connected with regards to this global achievement tile, and the longest trade route global achievement is worth a total of 2 victory points to the player that owns it. As with other global achievement tiles we've discussed, any player who exceeds the number of segments in the trade route that the current owner has will then take this tile for themselves. So for example, if I control a trade route with 5 segments and my rival later makes a trade route with 6 unbroken segments, then she would be able to take this tile from me. Next up are bridges. Bridges are basically more expensive roads that are built over rivers. These cost 1 log and 2 brick to construct, or can be constructed by paying 6 fish. Rivers are denoted by tiles which, of course, artistically look like they have rivers on them. But these also have brown dashed lines that indicate that there is a river on one of these tiles, making it easier for players to see that rivers are in this area and bridges need to be built here. A simple road will not suffice. For each bridge that a player builds, he or she gains 3 gold coins from the supply as a bonus from the island government of Catan for enhancing the island's overall infrastructure. And again, as noted previously, there is one river called the Great River, which has a gold nugget at the very end of one of the swamp tiles at the river basin, and settling here is worth 1 victory point. Bridges also, like ships and roads, will count towards the global achievement of longest trade route. Ships are the sea version of roads, and their main use is to allow players to travel across ocean/sea tiles to different islands that make up the nation of Catan. Ships cost 1 sheep and 1 log, but they could also be constructed for 5 fish. Like roads, ships and bridges can also count towards the longest trade route global achievement tile. Ships can be built on water or on an intersection of land and water. They can't be built on land as logic would suggest, and they also can't be built across rivers. Roads, ships, and bridges are all immune to coastal flooding, but road, ships, and bridges, as well as outposts, are all destroyed by the hurricane if it touches those hexes, and we'll talk about that later on. City walls are symbolized by a square token and require 2 brick cards to be built. A city wall can only be built under a city, and thus requires a city to be in place before it can be constructed. 1 city wall can be built per city, and it can be built regardless of whether the city has or doesn't have an oil rig and or metropolis on it. None of those are mutually exclusive. Now the only benefit of a city wall is it increases a player's maximum hand size by 2. Let me explain about that a little bit more. So in Catan, players can have as many cards in their hands as they want, but there's a catch. If a player rolls a 7 on a production roll, then all players with more than 7 cards must discard half of them, rounded up to the supply. Now, city walls increase this soft hand limit. One city wall allows a player to have a maximum hand size of 9, while having 2 city walls will give a player a max hand size of 11, and 3 will grant a player a max hand size of 13. So if a player rolled a 7, I could have 13 cards in my hand as long as I had 3 city walls on the board. Now, it's important to note here that you can only build 1 city wall per city, so I can't have a city with 3 city walls under it. It has to be built at a 1-to-1 ratio. It's also important to note again that only basic resource cards, commodity cards, and spice count towards hand size. And for spice, it's just spice that's not in a victory point stack. If it's in a victory point stack, it's independent of hand size. Tiles such as oil, fish, gold coins, as well as progress and development cards, both of which we'll discuss later, are all independent of this hand size cap and don't count towards this 7-card limit. City walls do not protect the city that they're built under from lava or coastal flooding, and city walls are not destroyed by the hurricane. So now let's talk about the robber and the pirate. The robber and the pirate are respectively the land and sea version of thieves that can block a player's resource production. The robber is placed on land and can block any of the major land tiles as shown: brick, ore, sheep, wheat, or logs, so any of the 5 basic resources, but he can also block production of a gold field, a volcano, a spice island, a pirate lair, or an oil springs hex. For any of this to happen, the robber token must be placed over the resource number of that hex. If the robber is present in this way, and the resource number on that hex is rolled, then no players with settlement points on that hex can collect resources from it. The robber can be moved to or from a resource hex when a player rolls a 7 on a production roll. Now, if this occurs, players may have to discard cards as discussed earlier. He can also be moved by a development card knight or a world knight. When the robber is moved to a space that blocks another player or player's production, the player that moved the robber can choose one of the impacted players and steal 1 random card from his or her hand. Now, only basic resource cards, commodity cards, and spice that's not already in a victory point stack are eligible to be stolen in this way. Tiles such as oil, fish, and gold coins, as well as progress and development cards, can't be stolen like this. The robber can be removed and otherwise moved back to a harmless location such as a blank desert hex or other location that doesn't negatively impact other players by a few factors. He can be removed by Santa or by paying 2 fish. Again, the distinction between moving and removing the robber is that moving the robber allows a player to take the robber from his current location and place him in a way where he will block other players' production or otherwise negatively impact them. Removing the robber only allows a player to change the robber's location and replace it with an empty tile. So basically, removing him to an area that's not going to impact any other players. The pirate functions in a very similar manner to the robber, except that he blocks sea trade. Now, specifically, he can block the port feature of a harbor settlement. This does not mean that the pirate can block production from the land hex or hexes that the harbor settlement is on. That would still be blocked by the robber, but he does block that trading port aspect that we discussed when we were talking about harbor settlements. The pirate can also block open sea fisheries, but not landlocked lakes, as he has no way to get to these lakes. And if you're using basic port tokens from the original Catan game, the pirate would be able to block those as well. The pirate can be moved by a player by rolling a 7 on the resource dice. It's also important to note here that if a player rolls a 7, they can choose to either move the pirate or the robber, or a mercenary or raider, which we'll talk about later, but not more than one of those tokens. They only get to choose one. When the pirate is moved by a player to block one of their rivals, the player who moved the pirate can steal 1 random resource card from the hand of any one of the players that the pirate is now blocking. Only basic resource cards, commodity cards, and spice that is not in a victory point stack are eligible to be stolen in this way, just like for the robber. Now, as he is at sea, the pirate cannot be moved or removed by a development card knight or a world knight, as those are both land bound. The pirate can, however, be removed by paying 2 fish, or if an ice shelf breaks under him, and we'll discuss that latter factor later in the video. Now you may have noticed that it's a bit more difficult to move the pirate than it is the robber. This is balanced out by the fact that there's a global achievement tile, Greatest Sea Robber Nemesis, or more aptly called Greatest Pirate Nemesis, which is worth 1 victory point. And this tile is awarded to the first player to defeat 3 or more pirates. And defeating a pirate, again, means moving or removing a pirate. Any player that moves or removes a pirate is given a black ship token as shown on the screen, which is called a defeated pirate token, and these are used to track the number of pirates that the player defeats. Like other global achievement tiles, if another player later on in the game removes more pirates than the player that currently owns this tile, then that second player will take the global achievement tile and its 1 victory point for themselves. So now let's talk about a few player tokens that I've briefly mentioned in this video, but you need to know more details on. These are the Mercenary, the Raider, and World Knights. The Mercenary is essentially the player-sponsored robber, and likewise the Raider would be the player-sponsored pirate, but we'll talk about him in a second. The Mercenary has an original purchase cost of 1 ore, 1 sheep, and 1 brick, and it can be used to block any of the same tiles that the robber can block, but the Mercenary can also be used to block the fantasy castle if it's in play, whereas the robber can't block that hex. Once purchased, the player can place the Mercenary on any of these eligible hexes, and they can immediately steal a card from any player that's settled on the hex in question in the same manner that's done for the robber or pirate. Each player has the option of constructing 1 Mercenary per game, and once purchased, the Mercenary token will remain somewhere on the board throughout the remainder of the game. Unlike the robber, the Mercenary does not technically block a player's production, depending on the number of settlement points that they have. Instead, he'll automatically take 1 resource card from the hex that's producing and provide it to the player that owns the Mercenary. For example, if the green player places her Mercenary on a grain hex with a resource number of 10, then the green player would be able to take a resource card from one of those 2 other players if the production number is rolled. So if the Mercenary were not here and the 10 was rolled, the red player would take 2 wheat cards from the supply from their city, and the blue player would take 1 wheat card. Green player would take nothing. If the Mercenary is added to this wheat hex and a 10 is rolled, then one of 2 things can happen. The green player can take the wheat card that would normally go to the blue player, or she can take one of the wheat cards that would normally go to the red player. But she can't do both, so she can only steal from one of the players that's settled on this hex. As mentioned, the Mercenary can be placed on any of the major land tiles: brick, ore, sheep, wheat, or logs, so any of the 5 basic resources, but he could also be placed to block production of a gold field, a volcano, a spice island, a pirate lair, or an oil spring, as well as the fantasy castle hex. Looking at the same example that we just discussed, but considering an oil spring as opposed to a wheat hex, we see the same effect. The green player's Mercenary allows her to steal 1 oil token from either the red or blue players when the production number is rolled. The Mercenary cannot steal commodities. So if a commodity was being produced, the Mercenary could only steal one of the basic resources. Once placed, a Mercenary can be moved to a new location if the player that owns the Mercenary pays 3 coins, or by any other player paying 6 coins. If a player that is not the owner of the Mercenary moves it in this manner, he or she can place it on an eligible tile and it will still impact resource production as mentioned above, but the player that moved it will not be able to steal cards from another player. A Mercenary also cannot be deployed by a rival player against its owner. So for example, the blue player cannot pay 6 coins to move the green player's Mercenary and place it on a hex where it would steal from the green player. It's not allowed. So there are a couple ways to remove the Mercenary, and another player can do this by using Santa, rolling a 7 on the production resource roll, by playing a development card knight, or using a world knight, or by paying 2 fish. So the Raider is to the Mercenary as the pirate is to the robber. And that is to say that it serves a very similar purpose to the mercenary, just at sea. The raider has an original purchase cost of 1 log, 1 ore, and 1 wheat, and it can be used to block any of the same tiles that the pirate can block. It has the same impact on the port feature of harbor settlements as the pirate does, meaning it blocks trade here completely if present. For fish production, the raider functions in the same way that the mercenary would, allowing the player that owns the raider to steal 1 fish tile from any player that is producing when the resource number is rolled. Let's look at an example. We see here that the red city and the blue settlement that we considered before are both also settled on a fishery that produces on a resource number of 4. If there's no raider in place, the red player takes 2 fish tiles from the supply due to his city being worth 2 settlement points. And as discussed earlier, each of these tiles can range from a value of 1 to 3 fish, hence the question mark on the screen. The blue player, because he has a settlement, only takes 1 fish tile. Now let's say the green player were to place her raider on the 4 fishery. She would be able to take one of the produced fish tokens from either the red or blue players, as shown here. She can take it from the blue player, or she can take it from the red player. She cannot do both. Now, once placed, a raider can be moved to a new location if the player that owns it pays 3 coins, or by any other player paying 6 coins. If the player that is not the owner of the raider moves it in this manner, just like the mercenary, he or she can place it on an eligible tile, and it will still impact resource production as we just discussed, but the player that moved it would again not be able to steal cards from any other player. In addition, a raider, just like the mercenary, cannot be deployed against the player that is its owner. A raider can be removed by another player, rolling a 7, paying 2 fish, or if an ice hex shifts. Like the mercenary, each player has an option of constructing only 1 raider per game, and once purchased, that token will remain somewhere on the board throughout the remainder of the game. Like moving the pirate, moving another player's raider, not your own, counts towards the greatest sea robber nemesis global achievement. And each time a raider is moved, so this would be moved or removed, a player can take a defeated pirate token in the same manner they would if they were to move or remove the pirate. So now let's talk about World Knights. There are 2 types of knights in Catan: World Knights and Knights from development cards, or development card knights. The latter is obviously a knight on a card, whereas a World Knight is a colored player token with a knight's head on top of it. There are 3 different levels of knights: Tier 1 or weak knights, Tier 2 or strong knights, and Tier 3 or mighty knights. And these tokens have 2 sides, a colored side and a gray side. The gray side means the knight is inactive, whereas the colored side signifies that it's active. Knights can be purchased for 1 sheep and 1 ore card, and once purchased they'll be placed on the board as an inactive knight. Knights can then be activated by spending 1 wheat card. Now if you want to upgrade a knight to a higher tier level, you have to spend an additional sheep and ore card. But you can make all those purchases at once. So for example, I can spend 3 sheep and 3 ore to buy a mighty knight outright, or I can slowly upgrade through various turns throughout the game a weak knight into a mighty knight. Regardless, when a knight is upgraded, it's automatically deactivated, so if you're buying a knight outright, you only need to pay the wheat activation cost once it's at that mighty knight level. If a world knight is ever in the path of lava from a volcanic eruption, it must move. An active knight will move automatically and can be relocated by its owner to any eligible spot on the board and would then become inactive. An inactive knight will require the owner to immediately pay 1 wheat to move it out of harm's way, or if that wheat can't be paid, it will be destroyed by the lava flow. Now, if the owner has a wheat, he or she has to pay it. This is not an option. An active knight can also have several effects. It can be used to move the robber or remove another player's mercenary. It can be used to displace another world knight if the knight or knights you have are stronger than the knight or knights the other player has that you're trying to displace. So for instance, if the orange player has an active tier 3 knight, he can displace another player's tier 1 or tier 2 knight. Similarly, let's say the blue player has an active tier 2 knight and another active tier 2 knight adjacent to that. he can displace an active tier 3 knight, because 2 plus 2 is 4, and 4 is greater than 3. If a knight is inactive, it can be displaced by any knight regardless of level. That said, an active blue tier 1 knight could displace an inactive orange tier 3 knight. The third use for world knights is that they can be used to block a location on the game board. A player can take a knight and place it in the midst of another player's longest trade route. This would be considered a break in the route and could result in that player losing the longest trade route global achievement if they have fewer than 5 segments on both sides of that blocked route. To move a placed knight, an owner must activate it. An active knight can be moved anywhere on the board except to a location already occupied by another player piece. Once moved, the knight is deactivated. Players can move each other's knights by some progress card effects or by displacing them with their own knights, as we just discussed. And the fourth use and the main purpose of world knights is to repel the barbarian attack. So now let's talk about the barbarian attack. The barbarians will attack once the barbarian ship token reaches the island of Catan, which is tracked by the barbarian attack tracker shown here. The barbarian ship starts on the farthest point away from the island of Catan, and when it reaches the bottom circle on the tracker, which is symbolized by a beach with a red circle around it, it will reach the island of Catan, at which point the barbarians begin to raid. The barbarian ship itself moves forward 1 space each time a player rolls a black ship icon on the event dice that's provided by the Cities and Knights expansion. Each time this is rolled, it moves forward closer and closer to Catan until eventually reaching the beach, at which point, again, the barbarian raid will occur. Now, a barbarian invasion sounds pretty horrible, but fortunately there's a way to defend the innocent Catanians from these barbarian scoundrels. Once the ship formally gets to the island beach, the Catan player's total strength is measured by the number of active world knights that they have on the board, with tier 1 knights counting for 1 point of strength, tier 2 knights counting for 2 points, and tier 3 knights counting for 3 points of strength. This number is cumulative of the strength of the entire island, so in other words, the strength of Catan is the sum of the strength of each player's active world knights. The barbarian strength is then calculated by the number of cities that have been constructed by all players on Catan. For instance, if the red player has 3 cities, the blue player 2, and the green player 1 city, then the barbarian strength will be a total of 6, 1 point per city. We then compare these two numbers to determine the outcome of the invasion, and there are 3 possible outcomes. The first is that the Catanians lose. The number of cities is larger than the strength of the active world knights on the island. In this scenario, the player or players who contributed the fewest number of world knights to Catan's defense will remove 1 city and replace it with a settlement to signify that city being sacked and ultimately destroyed. Players do still have a way to avoid this city sacking, and they can pay 7 gold to bribe the barbarians. If this is done, then their city is considered safe, and the player or players who contributed the second least to Catan's defense will have their city sacked instead. The second and third outcomes are if the Catanians win the fight against the barbarians, but 2 or more players contribute an equal amount of world knights to the defense of Catan. In this case, each player will get 1 progress card of any color of their choice. Now, if one player contributes more strength to Catan's defense than any other player, then that player will receive the Defender of Catan card, which is worth 1 victory point. Regardless of the outcome, after the invasion, the barbarian ship will reset to the beginning of the invasion tracker, and this entire process will begin again. Development cards are the other way to get knights, termed development card knights, and these knights can be used to move the robber or other player's mercenaries as previously discussed. They can also be used to steal or defend world wonders, which we'll discuss later in this video. But knights are not the only card in the development card deck. There are other possibilities as well. The first of these is a victory point, and if a player draws one of these cards, he or she can keep it face down in front of them as a secret victory point that other players don't know about. Other development cards include the rare Monopoly card, which allows a player to play this card and name one of the 5 basic resources. Based on the resource that the player names, every other player in the game has to provide all resource cards of that type to the player that played the Monopoly card. So for example, if I play a Monopoly on sheep, then every other player in the game has to give me all of their sheep cards. Now, an important note here is this only works on basic resources. It does not work on secondary resources such as pirate gold, fish, oil, or spice. In the development card deck, another card is the road building card, which lets players build free roads or bridges, and a Year of Plenty card, which gives a player more resources. The cost to buy a development card is 1 wheat, 1 sheep, and 1 ore, and a player could also get a development card by either paying 7 fish or by exchanging 2 Book Frenemies tokens to the supply. More on that last bit later. Now, the first player to purchase 5 development cards will gain the global achievement of Most Developed, which is worth 2 victory points. And like other global achievement tiles, if another player later gains more development cards, then that player will take this tile and its associated victory points for themselves. There's a second global achievement tile associated with development cards as well, specifically with development card knights. This is the largest army global achievement, and it's also valued at 2 victory points. The first player to purchase and use 3 development card knights, and note this does not include world knights, it is specific to development card knights, will be able to take this token. Now, like other global achievements, again, the largest army will be given to another player if that other player gains more development card knights than the player that currently has it. And again, the development card knights here are ones that have been used and they're placed to the side. Any inactive knights, so face down development card knights that you haven't played, do not count towards this global achievement tile. In Cities and Knights, there is a development chart provided to each player, and this chart tracks a player's progress in advancing their society in the 3 major disciplines: trade, simplified by the color yellow, politics by the color blue, and science by the color green. This is where the commodity cards finally come in. To flip the trade chart, 1 cloth is required for the first flip, 2 for the second flip, 3 for the third, 4 for the fourth, and 5 for the fifth and final flip. To flip the politics chart, the same pattern applies. 1 coin is required for the first, 2 for the second, 3 for the third, 4 for the fourth, and 5 for the fifth. And as you would expect, the same pattern for the science chart as well. This is done by spending paper. Now, each time a player flips to a new pane of the development chart, they gain an increased chance of gaining a progress card of the associated color. To further explain, let's say a player spends 1 cloth card to flip the yellow trade chart and build a market. You can see on the upper section of the bottom pane of this chart that the yellow castle symbol is on the white event dice, and there's also a red die with a 1 on it and a red die with a 2 on it. This means that if a player has a market, i.e. again the development chart is flipped to this page, and the player rolls a yellow castle symbol on the event dice as well as either a 1 or a 2 on the red Catan dice, then the player can take 1 yellow trade card from the supply, so this would be a yellow progress card. Now, paying more of a commodity will increase these odds. So for example, paying 2 more cloth to advance this chart to a trading house will give the player the ability to get a yellow progress card if they roll the yellow castle and either a 1, 2, or a 3 on the red Catan dice, which is just the red dice used in the game. The blue chart for politics and the green chart for science can be advanced in the exact same manner, and they can be used to gain a player blue and green progress cards respectively. Developing farther in these 3 disciplines grants additional benefits as well. Once a player has flipped their chart 3 times for any of the 3 disciplines, they gain a special effect. For trade, this effect is that players can trade any commodity with the bank at a 2-to-1 rate. They can trade, for instance, 2 cloth for a brick, or 2 cloth for another commodity like paper, but they can't do the reverse and trade 2 brick for a cloth card. For politics, players can promote any strong or tier 2 knight that they have on the board to any mighty knight or tier 3 knight, and they can do this at any time. Note that a player can have a maximum of 2 mighty knights on the board at any one time, if they're playing with 1 bag of player pieces, which is what's typically done. And for science, the effect indicates that if on a production roll a number is rolled that is not a 7, and the player would otherwise not produce any resources on that turn, in other words, they have no buildings on that resource number, then that player can take 1 basic resource card from the bank. Note, basic resource card can't be a secondary resource. When a flip chart for any of these disciplines is advanced to the 4th rank by spending a total of 10 of the associated commodity to get there, then a player earns a Metropolis token for that discipline, as long as they're the first player to achieve that milestone. Metropolis tokens can be thought of in the same way as global achievement tiles. There is one Metropolis token for each discipline, so 3 total in the game, and possessing one grants a player 2 victory points. Metropolis tokens must be placed on the board on a player's city, and cities with a Metropolis token are protected from coastal flooding, but they are not protected from lava. If such a city is struck with lava, then the city would still be demoted to a settlement as normal, and the Metropolis token must be placed on another city that player controls. As we discussed in the building section above, if no such city exists, a player cannot place the Metropolis token until such a city is built, and during that interim time, they don't realize the gains of having the Metropolis, so they wouldn't get those 2 additional victory points. Also during that interim time, the Metropolis could be stolen by another player, even if both players have max development charts. If multiple players are eligible to steal the Metropolis, then this is decided by the player with the most cards of the associated commodity in his or her hand, and if there's still a tie, then players break that tie by rolling dice. A player that has a Metropolis can spend 5 or more of the associated commodity cards to upgrade that discipline to the highest possible level and secure their hold on the Metropolis token. Now another player can no longer take this token from them by getting to the 5th level while the current owner is only at the 4th level on their development chart. However, a 5th level Metropolis can still be stolen in the scenario that lava from a volcanic eruption destroys the city and there's not another city to place the Metropolis on, which is what we just discussed. We've talked a lot about progress cards, but what exactly are they? Well, these cards are very similar to development cards, and they fall into the categories of those same disciplines that we discussed: green for science, yellow for trade, and blue for politics. They're all explained very thoroughly in the official Cities and Knights rulebook with regards to the specific cards that are in each deck, so I won't go into those in depth. But suffice it to say, science focuses on resource production, trade focuses on exchanging resources you have for ones you don't, as the name would imply, and politics focuses on hindering other players by, for example, stealing some of their world knights or boosting your own strength by activating your knights for free. Each of these categories also provides the possibility of a victory point being drawn, and if this card is obtained, it can be considered a secret victory point, just like the similar development cards would be that we previously discussed. Again, progress cards are obtained by advancing the development chart and rolling a colored castle on the event dice, as well as a valid number on the red Catan dice, as previously discussed and shown again here in this example. Progress cards can also be obtained by spending 7 fish, or via a frenemies token, which we'll discuss later on. Now let's talk about a few remaining tiles and special locations that we've not yet discussed, which can be found on the board in a game of MegaCatan. These are the North Pole, the Fantasy Castle, home hexes, the Hurricane, and icebergs. The North Pole is where Santa lives, as everyone knows. The official rules state that Santa needs wool from the sheep of Catan to make winter coats for his little elves. The effect of the North Pole is that any player on their turn can pay 1 sheep or wool card to Santa to move him to any hex that is not occupied by the robber or by a player's mercenary, including your own. If a player wants to move Santa to a hex occupied by a robber or another player's mercenary, this can be accomplished by paying 2 sheep to Santa as opposed to 1. You can never move Santa to a hex that has your own mercenary on it or to a non-land hex. If Santa is moved to a hex with the robber or another player's mercenary, he displaces it and it's removed, meaning it's placed back in the desert or to another out-of-the-way tile that won't affect other players. Neither the robber nor any mercenary can be moved to the North Pole at any time or to a hex that Santa is currently occupying. When Santa is placed on a hex by any player, all players who have an outpost, a settlement, a harbor settlement, or a city will get 1 gift token. Now note here that it doesn't matter how many buildings or what type of building a single player has on that hex. Regardless, as long as they have a building, they get 1 gift. As an example, if the blue player has a city and a settlement on a grain hex that Santa's placed on, he will only get 1 gift, not 2, despite having 2 buildings there. When Santa is placed at the North Pole, all players who have an outpost, a settlement, a harbor settlement, or a city, so a building, on that hex will get 2 gift tiles. This makes the North Pole a rather attractive place to, for example, build an outpost. Players can trade gifts that they receive from Santa for a variety of boons as governed by the gift exchange. For 2 gifts, a player can get a basic resource of his or her choice. For 4 gifts, a player can choose from one of the following options. They can take 3 random fish tokens from the supply, they can take 1 random spice card from the supply, they can take 3 gold coins from the supply, or they can take 1 oil token from the supply. Now, if a player manages to save up to 6 gifts, that can be exchanged for 1 victory point. Now, each player can only purchase a maximum of 2 victory points via this gift exchange method. Next up is the Fantasy Castle. This location does not get a resource number placed on it, but if a player has settled on it and a magic 7 is rolled, meaning that one of the resource dice has a 6 on it and the other one has a 1, then per settlement point that that player has, they can take a development card or a progress card from the supply. For example, if a player has 1 settlement on the Fantasy Castle and a magic 7 is rolled, then that player can take 1 development card or 1 progress card of any color from the supply. If a player has a city with an oil rig on the Fantasy Castle and a magic 7 is rolled, then that player can take any combination of up to 3 cards, either development cards or progress cards, or both, from the supply. There are 2 home hexes in the game, as pictured above, and they have slightly different artwork but an identical function. A resource number is not placed on either of these hexes, but if a player has a building of any type, an outpost, a settlement, a city, or a harbor settlement that's on a home hex, then when the robber or another player's mercenary is moved, the player who has one of these buildings on a home hex will receive 1 resource card of the type produced by the hex that that robber or mercenary token was moved to. And this is independent no matter how many buildings a player has adjacent to home hexes. They would only receive 1 resource card or resource tile per home hex. So for example, let's say someone rolls a 7 and decides to move the robber to a forest hex. If I have 2 settlements on home hex number 1 and 1 city on home hex number 2, I'll take a total of 2 wood cards from the supply. 1 is generated from home hex number 1 and 1 is generated from home hex number 2. Another thing to note here is that placing a mercenary on the Fantasy Castle will not trigger the effect of a home hex. The next special location to discuss is the Hurricane, and, as the name implies, this is a mobile location, not a hex that remains in one place throughout the game. The location of the Hurricane on Catan is symbolized by the Hurricane tile shown in the upper left-hand corner here. It's a cloud with a face on it that's blowing some wind. The Hurricane moves 4 spaces in a random direction at the end of each round, so this means that it moves after the last player takes his or her turn, before the first player takes their next turn. If any road, ship, bridge, or outpost is in the Hurricane's path, the Hurricane will destroy that structure and the player token will be removed from the board. Also, any active world knights in the Hurricane's path will be deactivated as they must shelter from the storm. There's no effect on already inactive world knights. Those would be considered to be already sheltering from the storm and not out and about. The direction of the Hurricane is determined by the spinner, and the Hurricane will move 4 spaces in the direction that the spinner points. For instance, if it's the end of a round and we take a look at our example board, when the Hurricane is currently raging over that brick hex in the bottom right, if the spinner lands on a 5 and we take a look at its position on the board, we see that the 5 is situated in the upper left direction. The Hurricane therefore will proceed to move 4 spaces in this direction. All roads, ships, outposts, and bridges in this path are destroyed, and any active world knights are deactivated. In this case, the blue player loses 3 roads, the red player a road and an outpost, and the white player loses 5 roads. In addition, the world knight is going to be deactivated. The Hurricane will move again at the end of the next round. If a Hurricane's trajectory ever moves it off the map, place it on the other end of the row or column that it exited the map from. Essentially, you're pretending Catan is a tiny sphere. So if you're a member of the Flat Catan Society, then MegaCatan might not be the game for you. Icebergs are another hex that are considered to be a sea tile. These hexes get a resource number assigned, but they don't produce resources. Instead, if the resource number on an iceberg is rolled, the ice will shift. And where the ice shifts is determined by a farther roll of 1 dice, and then the ice will shift on the side of the iceberg that contains that number. For example, if a player rolls a 6 as shown when determining where the ice will shift, then the ice will shift along the side of the hex that's shown in red, and any ship, like the white ship that's there right now, will be destroyed if it's on that location. In addition, if a pirate or a raider is present on the ice hex in general, and the ice shifts at any location around the hex, then the pirate or raider will be removed and returned to a vacant sea space. This type of removal does not count towards the greatest sea robber nemesis global achievement tile. If the destruction of a player's ship would break a sea shipping lane, then all ships flow back one space towards the building at the start of that shipping lane. In addition, if an iceberg hex is determined to be the hex that's impacted by an oil disaster, then instead of flipping the resource number over like we would for a normal resource hex, a second resource number is added. This ultimately results in the ice shifting more often and signifies that the ice shelf is breaking up faster. World Wonders can be purchased at any point on a player's turn as long as that player pays the cost listed on the Wonder card and meets the prerequisites to build the Wonder. There are 5 World Wonders, and these can be considered to be similar to other global achievements we've previously discussed. The wonders in the game are the Theater, which requires a player to have 2 cities on the board and pay 1 log, 1 brick, and 3 sheep to purchase it. The Cathedral, which requires a player to have 1 city on the board and at least 6 victory points, as well as pay 1 brick, 1 wheat, and 3 ore to purchase it. The Monument, which requires a player to have a city on the coast, as well as a 5-segment trade route somewhere on the board. The player must also pay 3 wheat and 2 ore to purchase this wonder. There's also the Great Wall, which requires a player to have any building, which could be an outpost, settlement, city, or harbor settlement, on a swamp hex, and pay 1 log, 3 brick, and 1 wheat to purchase it. And finally, there's the Great Bridge. This one requires a player to have any building. Again, this could be an outpost, settlement, city, or harbor settlement, and it has to be on the board adjacent to a bridge that's controlled by that player. The player must also pay 3 logs, 1 wheat, and 1 sheep to purchase this wonder. It's important to note that for these last 2 wonders, the text on the wonder card refers to a brown square and a purple square respectively. These are squares that are shown on the map in the rulebook, but as noted above, the brown square is simply a swamp or wasteland hex, and the purple square is a river with a bridge that the player owns adjacent to it. A wonder at level 1, 2, or 3 is considered under construction and incomplete. A player can never have more than 1 incomplete wonder in their control at any one time, and a player can have a maximum of 3 total wonders under his or her control at any one time. A wonder at level 1, when purchased, is denoted by the wonder marker being placed on the 1 section of the wonder track on that card. To upgrade a wonder, a player must again pay the resources listed on the wonder card to move it up to the next level. So, as shown in the example here, so let's assume here that the green player has 2 cities and is able to purchase the theater for 1 log, 1 brick, and 3 sheep. Once she does this, she'll take the theater wonder card from the supply, and she'll take her wonder marker and place it on the 1 square on the wonder tracker of this card. If she pays another 1 log, 1 brick, and 3 sheep, she can move the wonder marker to the 2nd space of the tracker, and by paying another set of those cards to the 3rd space. Now if she pays the 4th and final set of those cards, she has a fully constructed level 4 wonder, and this wonder is worth 3 victory points. Since the wonder is now considered complete, the green player can now start constructing another wonder, or opt to steal or buy a different wonder from another player. If at any point during a wonder's construction, the owning player no longer meets the requirement for a wonder, then they cannot increase the wonder to a higher level until the requirement is again fulfilled. So for example, let's consider the exact example that we just discussed and say the green player was trying to build the theater and she just purchased it at level 1, but on the next turn she loses one of her only 2 cities to a volcanic eruption. In this case now she only has 1 city and doesn't meet the requirement for a theater. She has to wait until she builds a 2nd city and again meets this requirement before she can progress this wonder to level 2, 3, or 4. So now let's talk about stealing wonders. On any player's turn, he or she can choose to steal another player's wonder as long as the stealing player doesn't already have a wonder under construction, but they can have a completed wonder. Wonders can be stolen if a player plays a minimum of 3 development card knights. These knights are used to attack the player who owns the wonder, and the player that owns the wonder can activate any previously unplayed development card knights that they control to defend the wonder. If the knights that the defending player activates equal or exceed the strength of the attacker, then the wonder is considered defended, and the attacker does not obtain control of that wonder. If the attacker's strength exceeds the strength of the defender, then the attacker will obtain control of that wonder at whatever level it's currently at. It's important to note that all knights participating in the attack of a wonder must be activated by the attacking player at once. In the example shown on the screen, the red player committed 3 development card knights to attack the blue player, and the blue player rebutted by activating 3 of her own knights to defend. Now at this point, the red player can't go back and activate another knight so that he wins the battle. He would have to have done that at the beginning. All attacking forces must be committed up front. Therefore, in this example, the battle is a draw, and since it's a draw, the wonder remains with the blue player. All development card knights used to attack or defend wonders can't be reused for another purpose. So they can't be reused to move a robber or a mercenary or in a second attack or defense of a wonder. However, all knights used in this way will still count towards the largest army global achievement. Players can also sell wonders as well, and wonders can be sold from one player to another via a voluntary transaction that involves any of the resources on the screen. So these would be the 5 basic resources, any of the secondary resources, and commodity cards. You can't trade development cards or progress cards to buy a wonder. Now spice that's already in a victory point stack as well as sequestered oil also can't be traded for wonders, only unsequestered oil and spice that's outside of a stack. And as with stealing a wonder can be sold at any of the 4 levels, but it only provides its owner the 3 victory point boon when it's complete. In other words, when it's at level 4. Frenemies is a nice little minor addition to the game, and it adds favor tokens. In essence, these tokens reward players for helping each other out, and there are 4 ways to earn them. The first is by moving either the robber, the pirate, or their own mercenary or raider harmlessly. And note for the raider and the mercenary, this does include the initial placement for those tokens. Moving one of these tokens harmlessly means the player has the option to move the token and chooses to put it in a benign location where it will not impact other players. Essentially, passing up an opportunity to hinder other players' development or progress throughout the game. The second way to earn a favor token is to remove the robber or the pirate, or remove a mercenary or raider. And for the mercenary or raider, that could be either the player's own or another player's. So, to say this in another way, if a player removes one of these tokens from a hex where it's negatively impacting another player, and the player that's doing the removal does not have any buildings on that hex, i.e. there's no direct benefit to the player that's moving the token, then he or she can take a favor token for performing this selfless act. The third way to get a favor token is to give away a resource card or tile to another player, and this must be accepted by that player. You can't just throw 4 ore cards at another player across the table and claim they were a gift, even if that player didn't want them. The player must take them willingly. And the final method is to, in good faith, advise another player about something in the game. This could be where to place a city, where to build a road, etc., or on general strategy. It doesn't matter. The only requirement here is that the advice must be solicited by the player that's receiving it, and the player providing it must be genuine. In any of these 4 scenarios, the player who's performing this selfless activity can take a random favor token from the supply. And as you can see on the screen, there are 5 different types of these favor tokens, each with a different effect. 2 gold book tokens allow a player to exchange them for 1 development card or 1 progress card of the color of a player's choice. 1 blue ship token can be exchanged for any 1 basic resource from the supply. 2 green compass tokens can be exchanged for a victory point, and there's no limit to how many victory points a player can earn in this way. 1 brown shovel token can be used to build a free road or a free ship, but note, not a free bridge. And 1 white carriage token allows a player to exchange any basic resource with the bank at a 2-to-1 rate, and this exchange can be done a total of 2 times per white favor token spent. So we finally made it to the end of this video, and we've gone over quite a few different rules of the game. As a reminder, the ultimate goal of Catan is obtaining the most victory points, and that number is set by the level of complexity that players desire, the number of players, and the amount of time that they wish to play the game, to name a few different factors. Let's quickly summarize the various ways to get victory points in this game. The first way is by obtaining one of the 5 specialist tiles associated with the 5 basic resources, or by obtaining one of the 4 specialist tiles associated with the secondary resources. Each of these is worth 1 victory point. The second way is by constructing different buildings and structures. Outposts and settlements provide a player with 1 victory point per building constructed of this type. Cities and harbor settlements are worth 2 victory points per building. Oil rigs are worth 1 victory point per building, and metropolises are worth 2 victory points per building of this type that players control. Collecting stacks of the same type of spice is another way to get victory points. Each time a player gains 3 of one kind of spice, that's worth 1 victory point, and then a player needs to gain 4 of that kind of spice to get the next victory point in that spice, and so on and so forth. Yet another method is to sequester oil, and once a player sequesters 3 oil tiles, those are worth 1 victory point, and sequestering the most oil grants a player the global achievement token of Environmentalist of Catan, which is worth a farther 2 victory points. Having the most gold coins from pirate layers gains a player the wealthiest settler global achievement tile, valued at 1 victory point. The player that contributes the most to Catan's defense in the event of a barbarian attack can become the Defender of Catan and gain 1 victory point in this way. Development cards and progress cards have the potential to have victory points as well. A player who purchases 5 or more development cards gains the most developed global achievement, which is valued at 2 victory points. A player who uses 3 development card knights gains the largest army global achievement, which is valued at 2 victory points. A player who removes the most pirates or raiders, a minimum of 3, gains the greatest pirate scourge global achievement, which is valued at 1 victory point. A player who has the most settlements on the coast can gain the harbor master global achievement, which is worth 2 victory points. And a player who constructs the longest trade route of a minimum of 5 segments gains the longest trade route or longest road global achievement, which is worth 2 victory points as well. When a player fully constructs a wonder and brings it to level 4, this is worth 3 victory points per wonder. Players can also collect victory points from frenemies tokens, with 2 green compass tokens being worth 1 victory point. And any player who settles on the gold nugget on the green swamp hex gains 1 victory point for settling at that location. Finally, if a player exchanges 6 gifts to Santa via the Christmas gift exchange, then that player gains a victory point from that as well. This is undeniably a lot of different rules, and players who have never played the game before may feel a little bit overwhelmed, so there are a few things that I would recommend excluding for the first time that you play, just to simplify things. The first and biggest thing to remove here is all of the Cities and Knights expansion. So this includes commodity cards, world knights, the barbarian invasion, progress cards, metropolises, the event die, and the development chart. This is the single biggest exclusion, and while it's very fun to play, removing all of these mechanics makes the game significantly simpler and easier to understand, as the gameplay is much less involved. You can also very easily remove pirate layers and by extension gold coins, the greatest pirate scourge specialist tile, as well as the wealthiest and poorest settler global achievement tiles, the Spice Islands, the associated specialist token for spice, as well as the spice cards, world wonders and the wonder tracker token, the fantasy castle, the home hexes, the raider and the mercenary, and finally the North Pole, Santa, and the Christmas gift exchange. There are other things, of course, that can be removed that are not shown here, such as fish, oil, and the frenemies expansion, just to name a few. But those, I think, are very relevant to the gameplay, and they add a lot to the gameplay of MegaCatan, so I would recommend keeping those in. They're also relatively easy to understand, and frankly, if you remove cities and knights, that's by far the most complex thing on this list. You can probably keep the rest of these in. I recommend providing players with a card similar to this, which outlines exactly what the cost of the different items that we've gone over in this video is and how players can obtain these. It simplifies gameplay and speeds it up for players to have a reference sheet to refer to when they want to take a particular action on their turn. It also means players don't have to memorize all of this information. Now, considering the last slide when we talked about things that we could remove and keep the general core of the MegaCatan gameplay, if you remove those from this building costs card, it becomes significantly smaller and even easier to read and play. And this is a version of that simplified building cost card available to print if you screenshot this window. Finally, I also like to provide players with these on the back of the building cost card, which is the Christmas gift exchange and the World Wonders upgrade costs. Well, that's it. We've reached the end of our video, so if you're not yet quaking in fear with the thought of playing MegaCatan, then I hope you give it a go soon. Until next time, this is Catan, signing off.